Nice to see everyone, and a few names on the screen. I thought that was a nice way to be interactive too, Desley, by the way. It's nice to hear what people are doing when you can't leave the office, essentially. Thanks, Ben. So good morning, everyone. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on, being the Ngunnawal people, same as Tom and Trudy and some others possibly. It's a nice freezing cold day in Canberra, so I'm a little bit envious that I'm not able to be in Queensland, and also, I guess, hopefully look forward to getting up to the Torres Strait when we're allowed. So that's great news to hear that. I think it was Paula was on board, so I look forward to that. I'm going to talk quickly about the impact evaluation, and I think we spoke, I guess everyone's sort of spoken about the impact COVID's had. So this year for us, we were meant to be out in community doing sort of engagement, and obviously we were able to get to some communities, so it's great to see you, Tamika and Amy. We were able to visit earlier this year, pre-COVID, and hopefully we'll be able to get up there again shortly. I'm going to talk about the impact evaluation, what we're looking at, and we can go to the next slide, if that's cool, Ben. I come from the Modowa clan in Papua New Guinea, so Milne Bay, which is part of the reason I'm excited about the Torres Strait, is that I'm from the other side of the Torres Strait, in Milne Bay, in Bonabonna specifically, so a coastal island boy, but grew up in Ngunnawal country in Queanbeyan. The youngest of three, so I've got a brother and a sister, and then a bunch of nieces and nephews scattered throughout Queensland and Papua New Guinea now as well, and a great niece as well, recent addition. And I too am keen to go fishing in the Torres, as Tom sort of alluded to before. Although I know that the fishing's better in Papua New Guinea, that's the word on the street. Next slide, please. I should actually say that wharf is a tourism plug, so if you ever want to go up to Papua New Guinea, there's some great snorkeling, and that's actually where my sister renewed her vows about 5 years ago. In terms of the impact evaluation, I work at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Program at ANU, so with Ray Lovett and some others that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Ray's been leading the Mayi Kuwayu study, which I'll speak about later, but essentially we're led by Indigenous researchers. We're also partnering with Menzies School of Health Research, so David Thomas, who did some work with NACHO, and they're talking about the smokes projects that a number of you were involved in, is also on the Tackling Indigenous Smoking Evaluation Executive and a co-PI. And we are working with basically everyone that Tom sort of outlined in his TIS program overview earlier, including the National Best Practice Unit, Quit Victoria, the Quit Lines, Circa, and so on. Next slide, please. This is a photo of the team at ANU. And I guess essentially we're looking at trying to showcase bits of pieces that work in reducing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tobacco use, but also looking at improving health and wellbeing more generally. So trying to look at a relatively comprehensive approach. And I'll explain about the method that we're taking to try and provide a more complete picture than potentially just looking at something like smoking prevalence. So while smoking prevalence is extremely important, there are other aspects that we should look at and consider. And I think things like COVID have sort of really highlighted how complicated behaviour change can be and the different ways that we can engage with communities. Other things that we prioritise and work on are around Indigenous leadership and governance. So I'll speak about the Indigenous governance arrangement that we have for this evaluation. We'll also speak about, I guess these are principles that that underline the evaluation. So Indigenous data sovereignty, community-driven research, partnership approaches. I can't stress enough the importance of strength-based messaging, and I guess I'll speak a little bit about that when we show you, I guess, some of the prevalence slides, and then also the method that we're using, as I mentioned, is trying to capture a more complete picture. So sometimes mixed methods can be particularly useful for providing context to numbers and making sure that there's, I guess, minimising the opportunity for misinterpretation, which we see all the time. Next slide, please. So that's evaluation. I should have actually mentioned or seen if anyone was paying attention, but there's a, do you want to go back a slide, Ben, if that's all right? Just wanted to see if anyone notices or we can go forward. If there's a little sheepdog in the front. So we, so it was actually a test of our unit to see if anyone picked up that dog down the front, and basically no one did. So it'd be interesting if anyone else did. I know the National Best Practice Unit probably heard me say that before, so no doubt they did. Thanks, Ben. We can skip along now, next slide. So moving into the evaluation, as I mentioned, we do have an Indigenous governance arrangement. So we are funded by the Department of Health, and we have research partners, and we also have Titu Thame, which means to share knowledge. So that's our reference group, which provides insight into and guidance into our overall direction, but also plays a key role in the tackling Indigenous smoking evaluation or impact evaluation. The program executive is led by Ray Lovett, Jill Guthrie, David Thomas, Katie Thurber and myself. And we meet quarterly with Titu Thame, which is a whole range of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from across the country, which help us to give us some direction, but also assist in some of the interpretation of results. And then we have a number of evaluation team members, including 2 Aboriginal Master of Applied Epidemiology students at the moment, which is actually quite interesting. So the 2 focuses of their work at the moment, one's looking at remote Australia, and then the other one's looking at smoke-free homes and the implications around that. So sort of leads well to what Tom was talking about before in terms of Indigenous organisations and the need to promote smoke-free policy. Next slide, please. So what are we looking at? We're looking at basically anything that's smoking related or tobacco related, and we're looking at whether or not smoking related outcomes improve faster in areas with tackling Indigenous smoking funding compared to areas without tackling Indigenous smoking funding. As I mentioned, it is relatively comprehensive, so we're not just looking at prevalence, but we're looking at percentage of people who quit and stay quit. We're looking at reduced uptake in terms of our younger people, delaying uptake or not taking up at all. We're looking at behaviours related to quitting, smoking initiation, as I just mentioned, secondhand smoke exposure. Smoking and pregnancy, as Tom mentioned before, is a priority. And so that's one area that we're looking at. We're looking at perinatal data on that, attitudes about smoking, as well as recording smoker status in health service. And we've seen some significant increases in that across the country. Next slide, please. Tom sort of actually outlined this quite well before. So why do we need this? I guess as we're approaching the halfway mark, it's useful to know what is working. If we have evidence that the TIS work is helping improving smoking-related outcomes. We also sort of heard from everyone before about the opportunity that COVID's given us to take a breath and reconsider how we work and be more strategic in some of the approaches that we take. And so the evaluation kind of fits quite nicely into that, in that we are doing some work to identify the type of work that TIS teams are undertaking and the intensity of that work over time. So I should also flag that we're looking at data from as early as we can get it. So in some cases, the earliest sort of data sets we can get it from 1994 all the way through to the current time. So depending on when we actually finalise the analysis, it could be in the next 12 to 18 months if there are various data sets available that we can look at. And then considering what types of behaviours that the tackling Indigenous smoking teams have focused on to see if there are associated changes with that. So for example, if there was a big focus on smoking and pregnancy in some areas, perhaps we would see changes in smoking and pregnancy captured in perinatal data sets. So if we're looking at youth and thinking about deadly choices and the engagement with schools, perhaps we could focus in on smoking uptake and smoke-free homes and the implications around youth and young people and the next generations coming through. So really trying to hone in on areas where there are some serious successes. And I guess on that note, I should also say, while it is great to see a number of familiar faces that have been in the program for a long time. Also just to acknowledge the success in reducing smoking prevalence across the country, but particularly among youth and young people and the next generations is really exciting. Next slide, as I digress. So what's the process looking like? So at the moment we're piloting a sort of a mapping tool with a number of tackling Indigenous smoking teams, again, trying to understand what sort of activities have been undertaken over the last 10 years and the type of intensity and the reach that those programs have had, which is, as you can imagine, across a country like Australia is incredibly diverse. And even if you think about your own region, some of the activities are probably quite diverse within that region and over time. It'll be interesting to see what implications COVID has as we focus more on social media and different ways to engage with people. We do have access to about 8 data sets at the moment, so establishing some sort of coding and those sort of academic processes to analyse that data. We also are looking at the Mayi Kuwayu study, which I'll speak about in a second, and then again at the end, bringing together all those findings to provide a more comprehensive picture than just looking at smoking prevalence, which I'll show you on a slide. So with this also gives us an opportunity to provide feedback to communities. So when we're given all the paperwork that you've had to complete to get access to ABS data and perinatal data sets and PBS data, etc., there is an opportunity to hopefully provide information that is relevant to your region back to you, just because we will be able to do more nuanced analysis of that now that we have access to it. And then evaluation reports, publications, community feedback, etc., is sort of an ongoing process. So it looks a little bit linear in this slide, but hopefully it's an ongoing conversation. That's one of the reasons I'm here with you today at the start of this project, or the middle. Next slide, please. Defining boundaries. This is just to give you some insight, I guess, of the process so far. So I guess at the front end of this this slide, we have the language map. Then in 2010, we have what were the original 57 regions, and now we're sort of moving towards a map that looks a little bit more like this. So I guess that's just to say that there is variation across time, and so one of the biggest challenges we actually have at the moment is trying to identify those regions, and then also recognise the differences in terms of different programs that have been rolled out over time and how we've been able to reflect and adjust based on community need and so on and so forth. So that's the first phase. Next slide, please. Which you'll hear about. You'll probably hear from me later on. We can probably slip this slide because I think Tom stole my thunder before. But I did want to say one of the benefits of being able to drill down on some of this data and spend a bit more time is that we can better understand and unpack some differences. So while that showed a relatively stagnant look at remote smoking prevalence, once we start to look at it by age and sex and gender, we can actually see some differences. So I guess the remote example is a nice example to look at, because when we look across the ages, we can actually see shifts in smoking prevalence over time. And you can see 45 to 54 and then 55 plus, there's been sort of an increase in daily smoking prevalence, which is quite interesting, which shows that if you start to think about it, I guess the hypothesis for me would be that smokers aren't dying as young and that actually the health overall is improving, and as a result we're seeing increase in smokers over time in the older age group. So while it's kind of could be a deficit-based model, there's actually some silver lining in that people are living longer. So there are it's kind of a nuanced argument, I guess, around how we look to address that issue. Hopefully that makes sense. I feel like I didn't articulate that very well, but anyway, hopefully there'll be some time for questions and we can discuss that in a second. Next slide, please. In urban areas, we have seen some significant declines across almost all age groups. Again, the older generations there, we're sort of seeing some mixed messaging. The lines are actually confidence intervals, so you can see that there's not actually a significant increase at the end as well. But I guess if you're comparing 2004-5 to today, you can see significant declines across all age groups. Next slide, please. And that sort of results in almost 50,000 fewer daily smokers, a reduction of 9.8% smoking prevalence, and more than 23,000 lives saved. So I should say, put the caveat on the 50,000 fewer daily smokers today than previously. That would be if the population stayed the same. So if we did have smoking rates of about 50%, as we saw in 2004-5, then we would have a lot more daily smokers than we do today. So again, I guess reiterating that message I shared before, that you are doing exceptional work and that we are seeing significant reductions in tobacco use. And so that's worth celebrating. We often don't celebrate those successes. So I just wanted to acknowledge that again. And some of that information was actually published today in a slide that I'll share later on, which I thought was the next slide, but anyway. Next slide, please, Ben. So these are the data sets that we're looking at that I sort of mentioned before. MBS, perinatal data sets, health service data, PBS data, so NRT and other medicines to help people quit smoking, Quitline, and then Mayi Kuwayu. Next slide, please. And again, our hypothesis would be that among TIS regions, we would see a decrease, for example, in smoking during pregnancy, or increase in smoke-free homes, or obviously positive impact on smoking-related behaviours. Next slide, please. The Mayi Kuwayu data, I've got a link there in case you haven't completed the survey, but it's a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander owned health and wellbeing study focusing on culture and wellbeing and health behaviours that are associated with that as well, including smoking. And at the moment, we've actually just ticked over about 10,000 participants, which is the largest longitudinal Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health survey with a rolling recruitment. So if you haven't completed, I encourage you to do so. And I know a number of teams have been involved in that sort of data collection process, and some people are using it to help evaluate their own tackling Indigenous smoking or smoking programs. And there is actually a question in there on deadly choices. So I know the Institute and Carbel and a number of others have worked with us on this in this space. Next slide, please. Oh, you can skip a few to fill out the questions. Thanks. So these are the smoking questions in the Mayi Kuwayu study. And you can see they're relatively generic or standard smoking questions. I know a number of tackling Indigenous smoking teams have used them within their community information sort of gathering and various community events. And it provides us with some insight into smoking behaviours, and again will help to inform the evaluation, but also it can inform programs and services moving forward. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, it does create an opportunity for capacity building, both within the academy and universities, where we create space for Indigenous students, but also creates an opportunity for us to provide data back to communities that have been completing surveys like the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Survey and Social Survey and things like that. So it does create opportunities to provide more useful and meaningful data back to communities. And if you have particular questions or areas of interest, we might be able to look at certain indicators and provide that back if that's something you're interested in. You will be hearing from me in the near future. So if there's anything that you're particularly interested in or would like us to look at, we're always happy to hear from you, and we can try and address those questions as best we can. Dissemination of research finding materials. One of one of the underpinning principles that we have is around trying to provide findings as soon as they become available. So it's not necessarily something where we'll finalise and write up a report at the end, but as soon as information becomes available, we try to share that. So it's sort of an ongoing relationship. And the Mayi Kuwayu study, obviously we return data to those services and communities in accordance with sort of our agreements with them, or as they guide us to provide that data back to communities. Next slide, please. This was a slide I thought was earlier. It's just today we did release a review of tobacco use among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with Health InfoNet. So hopefully the slides are available online, but you can Google it if you want, and it sort of provides a picture of all the current evidence that is available, and also talks about the reduction in smoking prevalence over the last 10 or so years. And you'll notice there is also a plain, what they've called a plain language summary, a fact sheet, and there's also a video highlighting some of those key findings. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that, and hopefully it is useful. Next slide, please. I think that's it for me for today, but I've just wanted to leave you my contact details in case anyone has any questions and would like to discuss anything, any priorities or anything like that. Thanks, everyone.
So does anyone have any questions for Raglan right now, or I can put those details, the contact details in the chat area for you to copy and use later, or of course these presentations are going to be online on the TISRIC, so yeah, they're available then. If nobody has any questions, we might pause right there in the program, and we've got a